firstly, when people join in the company, we always acknowledge that truth is super important and it's okay to be wrong. And that means that if we need to rebuild something for the third or fourth time to fit our users' needs better, we shouldn't shy away from that and be protective of our work. And that means that we can choose better APIs and we can all say this isn't ideal and we can make things better with another iteration on it. And that kind of reduces the emotional attachment to people's work when they create a spec or they create an API design that we would like to change.
Yeah.
From Notable Capital, this is Founder Real Talk, where we get real about the challenges that founders and startup executives face and how they've grown from tough experiences. Founder Real Talk is part of the Notable Capital family of podcasts, and you can access all our podcasts at notablecap.com. I'm your host, Glenn Solomon. Without further ado, here's today's episode.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be joined today by Tony Holdstock-Brown, co-founder and CEO of Inngest. Inngest is a platform for building reliable, scalable backend workflows. We at Notable were fortunate to lead Inngest's seed right as Tony and his co-founder Dan were starting the company. And we're super excited to welcome Tony back to the podcast today to announce Inngest's $20 million Series A. We're thrilled to be doubling down on Inngest alongside our friends at Altimeter Capital and Andreessen Horowitz. The company's grown a lot and really started to inflect since we last brought you on here and since we invested in the seed. And so super excited to have you back here to discuss a bit about building an extraordinary developer experience, becoming a critical developer tool for AI, and Inngest's growth journey.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the trust, the faith, and continuing to work with us. Really, really happy to have you on board and excited to be here.
Awesome. Maybe just to start for some quick context before we kind of dive in here, can you just give kind of a high level for folks on Inngest, what you guys do, and perhaps an example of how customers are using you guys in production today?
Yeah, for sure. So Inngest, short one-liner, allows you to build scalable backend, reliable workflows. And in a way, if you're building these products, you would have to use an event-driven system or a queuing system. And we take all of that time, compress it down to importing an SDK using step.run, and then the entire thing works without you using a queuing system or learning how Kafka works and so on. So essentially, any developer can start building these backend workflows, which is really, really exciting because it opens the door to a whole bunch more in your product. And so if you take that as the basis, people use this for a bunch of stuff. When we started the company, actually, interestingly, AI wasn't really a big thing. GPT 3.5 wasn't necessarily I don't even think it was out yet. Timing
I think it was
just
GPT-2.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And they were the early adopters, but it wasn't embedded in everyone's product. And so when people started using us, they were using us for your traditional product stuff, integrations, webhooks, queuing systems, the whole Kafka related stuff. And the interesting thing about our model is we work everywhere: serverless, servers, Kubernetes, bare metal. Beforehand, it was really difficult to build step functions, especially on serverless platforms. So to begin with, it was I need to reliably handle a webhook. Or when somebody pays for my product, I need to do X, Y, and Z. Or if somebody orders something in my e-commerce platform and I deal with 3PL and warehousing myself, I need to make sure that there's inventory, I need to dispatch the order, and so on, reliably. People using us for this sort of stuff, building these sorts of workflows in their product. We made it far easier to the point where what would take 3 months took a day, which is super exciting for all of the engineers that used us. Then as the AI thing did its thing over time, people started to realize that you would use an AI agent or an AI LLM call, and then you would use some tools or write some code or do some RAG and then call another AI agent. And so you would build these step functions with orchestration and observability all in one place. So people started using us for that, which is now super common. And that's almost a requirement to go to production. You need to have these systems in order to push AI to production in a reliable way in your product.
Yeah, super interesting. I want to pull on one thing you mentioned there around just kind of abstracting this complex sort of suite of tools into one SDK that people can use. I think what we've seen, we've been fortunate to invest in a bunch of interesting serverless products, is that really the winning combination is, can you take complex infrastructure, abstract it into something that's super simple with amazing developer experience? And I think one of the really striking things about Inngest is even from back when we met and you guys were 3 people raved about the developer experience. And I think especially now, folks tend to attribute that to taste. They're just like, whoever built this has really good taste, and that's why the DX is so good. I'm curious, how do you think about like ensuring great developer experience?
Yeah.
And as you're building a product and putting it through the cycle, like how do you build that into the product that you're ultimately shipping?
Yeah. So there's so much to talk about with this, and I definitely agree with taste. There's a lot to it. Taste, principles, and your opinion on how the software should be used. And I've got a few, I wouldn't even say they're hot takes, but very, very strict positions on this. Firstly, I think that in the days of the 2000s and 2010s, and rightly so, a lot of people that were building infrastructure were building infrastructure to solve specific CS problems. And they didn't necessarily think about the end user because those problems had to be solved.
Yep.
So for example,
Like
Kafka.
scaling problems.
Yeah, exactly. You want to deal with like hundreds of thousands or millions of messages a second or tens of millions, then you want to solve that specific problem regardless of the API. And that's kind of terrible from an everyday developer point of view, because then you need to bend your entire application to the infrastructure versus just saying, hey, in an ideal world as a developer, what would I use? And how would I declaratively describe my product?
Yep.
And like, you can see that with the front end ecosystem, it got very much declarative. Like, I want this, this, and this, and React is just declarative. But from the infrastructure side, that didn't really happen. So generally speaking, the views are like, previously, people just didn't care because they had problems to solve. And as a base, the problems needed to be solved. And as we got more and more infrastructure and we got better at doing this and the patterns got more specific and concrete, I think like there's room for us to say, as developers, what would we like to use? And how can we abstract the rest of the infrastructure so that we can focus on the product, which is what we do. And then from there, we must accept, as somebody that builds these sorts of developer tools and infrastructure, we will do all of the really, really hard things for our user to maintain that really good API that allows you to declaratively describe what you want to do, which makes our life a lot more difficult because we blend the event streams with the queues with state, which is challenging, but it makes the user's life so much better. And that's how people can build what would take months in like a day. So we have a pretty hard view on that. And then largely thinking about what makes the APIs good for the developers overall is super important. So we, as much as we can, actually try not to compromise on that and think about like, what's the intended use case? What would developers like to see? And how would it work in their product as the key thing?
I'm curious, how do you assess that? Like, have you found a good way to, before you actually ship something to production, assess, is this actually a good developer experience?
Yeah, this is where the element of taste might come in, There's definitely some element of taste to it and experience. I think like after doing this for almost 2 decades, you have like a lot of experience to draw from. And if you'd have asked me this when I was 3 years into my career, I would have created maybe the most insane APIs. It wouldn't have looked good. So like you can draw from experience. There is definitely an art to simplifying things to their core elements without taking away power, which I think like is an art in many places, like marketing. To distill a message down to its purest form is really tough. And that's like what experienced marketers do. As an engineer, to distill the API down into the bare minimum to make it declarative without losing power, it is tough. But there are specific ways that I think you can do it. Firstly, it's first principles. What are you trying to achieve? What would be ideal? And what is the root problem? We have a thing called step.wait for event, which on the face of it is absolutely insane because you have a step function or a workflow. It's running 10 steps in parallel. And then you can say, I want all of the functions I want the functions to stop after these 10 steps and wait for this other specific thing to happen. And if it doesn't happen within 24 hours or a day or 2 days or a week or 5 minutes, continue on, but then get like the resulting variable, the event will be undefined or nil or null or whatever your language uses. That's really tough because it's quadratic and we have to do a ton to make that work under the hood. But that API is really powerful because you want the function to stop until something happens, and that's the root problem that you're solving. And so figuring out essentially the root of the problem that you're solving is super important. versus the APIs or the CS thing that you're solving. And then building from that is like the whole first principles thing really, really helps. But yeah, I think it's definitely partly experience as well, and iteration. You can't really assume that you've nailed it first attempt. There's like a lot about, and I think we'll end up talking about this a fair amount, like time to value. How easy is it to use? How easy is it to understand? And iteration definitely helps with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems like the technology's mature enough now that you can work backwards from what is the problem that the developer wants to solve, as opposed to working forward from like, what is the core technical innovation unlock here?
Yeah, exactly. Like people know about compute storage. They know about like, oh, we're going to write blocks and then we're going to have compute on the top of it. In the case of like ClickHouse or DocDB or any of the systems that have been there beforehand, you know about like LSM trees for events and for writing stuff. So like things are just good. People have solved a lot of problems, and that makes it really easy to take that view.
Yep. How do things change as you scale up your organization? Because like you can impart your own taste when you're a 5-person organization and you're probably looking at every PR. At some point, you guys are now much larger than that, and you need to sort of distribute the work and delegate a little bit more. How do you think about creating a culture in which everybody is kind of obsessed with developer experience and shipping products that meet your bar?
Yeah, this is such a good question. And again, a multi-parter. And I think the things to talk about are culture, ego, decision-making, the ability to accept being wrong, and the desire to get better overall as a summary. One thing that you'd note if you work in teams, sometimes there can be really strong egos about doing things. And I've worked in teams beforehand, like 10 years ago, where there are really good developers, but with really strong opinions. And I think like, firstly, when people join in the company, we always acknowledge that truth is super important and it's okay to be wrong. And that means that if we need to rebuild something for the 3rd or 4th time to fit our users' needs better, we shouldn't shy away from that and be protective of our work. And that means that we can choose better APIs and we can all say this isn't ideal and we can make things better with another iteration on it. And that kind of reduces the emotional attachment to people's work when they create a spec or they create an API design that we would like to change.
Yeah.
So understanding that is super important. And then the other stuff is just like, honestly, the culture side of things and the imparting of like, we make our users' lives easier, even if it makes our life worse, is super important. There are definitely times where you kind of like review specs and the process helps out as well. So we have like a spec process where if somebody wants to write a new feature, they'll describe it and then we'll like review it and honestly give feedback before we do the implementation. And there are definitely times where we've had to change things, but for the most part, the principles aspect and understanding that, we do the difficult thing kind of works out through the team. And if we see people sort of incorrectly choosing different APIs, it's actually a really good sort of like learning moment, because we're both coming at it from maybe different expectations. And if you're coming at things from different expectations, there's probably a knowledge gap or an assumption difference. And if we can figure out what that assumption difference is, either I'm wrong or there's something to be improved in their decision making.
Yep.
And we can sort of meet in the middle, which is great. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think it goes to like sort of having, you guys need to be opinionated. You also need to be able to iterate on those opinions over time.
Yes.
And I think the other thing that's interesting about Inngest and about other sort of popular serverless tools is that they are much more opinionated than I think the last generation of developer tools, which are a little bit more choose your own adventure. Yeah. And so I think in some ways, like you're putting developers on a path and kind of constraining what they should be doing with the product. And I'm curious how that affects how you think about getting feedback from your customers.
We have some super interesting feedback, especially being infrastructure, because it's super generic. People can build anything with infrastructure. So you might have like warehousing companies, you might have real estate companies, insurance companies, and then just like random B2C stuff. And so much different feedback that conflicts often. Firstly, and I think like it's interesting going into the company with like a 10-year or 15-year plan. I had this idea of what you could do when you put all of this in one product. And so we do have a long-term strategy overall for the company. And that's helpful to guide the feedback and see, does it fit with our long-term plan? Does it validate our long-term plan? Is our long-term plan just absolutely off? And then secondly, like, is this feedback correlated to how other people use the product? And what type, honestly, just like what type of person is this user? Because like, there are, I guess, 3 types of users. There's users that understand the problem and want to do it themselves, which is the sort of NIH stuff that you read about. Everyone's just like, there are some companies that build everything in-house up until they understand the problem and they're like, this was a bad decision. We need to outsource some of this stuff and use some infrastructure.
Yeah.
As the people that have done that before understand the problem and like, we don't want to deal with this ever because we're going to lose a year's worth of work. And there's the people that don't understand the problem but just want it to be solved without really looking into the details. And depending on the type of user, like you'll definitely get different feedback. Understanding that and where it fits in is super interesting because the don't understand the problem type of user is going to give you feedback on not necessarily the low-level fundamentals, but the problems that they want solved.
Yeah.
And then the people that are super in the weeds might give you feedback that's maybe just a little too, like specific, which then if you think about it from the first principle stuff that we talked about beforehand, you need to take it up a level and then realize the problem that they're trying to solve when they're being far too technical. So there's like, I don't know, there's like a lot of different ways to listen to feedback. And I think it's all relatively nuanced actually. And no piece of feedback is the same, even if they're asking for the same feature, if you look at it through that lens, and that helps you sort of differentiate as well.
Yeah, maybe let's dive into sort of the project zero and how you're thinking about that. Like, what was the impetus? Maybe give folks kind of the high level understanding of what you guys have built there and sort of what was the impetus to
sure. So,
to adapt the product in that way.
Sure. So we check in with our customers, just see how they're doing. Want to talk to all of our users and make sure they're happy. There are 2 conversations that come to mind about this. One with Outtake.ai, security company that uses for their orchestration. Another with Contentful. And in both conversations, they were saying, hey, we've got this async stuff that uses these step.runs to build these workflows that run asynchronously in the background, reliably, and they deal with all of our scale, which is great. But we also want to use the same code in our APIs, and we want some users to be able to run things instantly, synchronously. So now we've got this split, and we re-implemented all of our stuff in Inngest and our APIs, which is like hard. And they just wanted to run it normally. And we had some other conversations with DevRel engineers, and they were like, well, this is really cool, but it's all async. And even if you have the real-time stuff that we have in which you can publish updates to the front end, people will still build APIs as their first thing inside any project. So if we could bring you steps inside your APIs, if we could allow you to easily make ingest functions synchronous and meet you where you're at in any framework, you would get all of the ingest fun stuff, the reliability, the scalability, the tracing, the APM, the metrics, plus the retries and the flow control, but like anywhere, and you wouldn't have any setup. That would be really, really cool, because then you would have the sync and the async sort of merged together. And if you're building regular products, you wouldn't even need to know about orchestration systems or queues or event streams or state. It would just do the thing for you. And then it's kind of cool because when you build your APIs, you go on the product and you get like everything out of the box. You get like APM just accidentally because we had to have that for the orchestration system.
Yep.
So again, it's like shortening the time to value and making it easier to understand / more applicable. And it doesn't actually like, there's not a big difference to the regular product. It's the same thing, just dressed differently to make it easier to use, which is sort of going back to your original point about sort of experience, how you make that better.
I think the other very interesting shift that you guys have had in your business, and you allude to this at the top, is just orienting more and beginning to support more AI workflows, and in particular, agents. Obviously, the market is changing very quickly, and the way people are building software is changing very quickly. How do you think about sort of anticipating what's going to change and what's going to remain the same, and sort of orienting Inngest strategy accordingly?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. An example of first principles is in November, I hacked together Agent Kit in a week, and then we released the thing. And Agent Kit took a different view to every other AI SDK at the time. It was specifically for agents, and it largely focused on context engineering, which has now become a big thing this month. And the difference was you will build deterministic state, and your tools and your agents will manipulate that state, which is regular code, regular types, regular data, and then you can update the agent's input, state, and whatnot prompts based off of that overall state that you've modified in regular code. And the overall challenge was like, well, context is a big deal. If you're going from agent to agent, you need to manipulate this and manage this. And so the principles are, that's non-deterministic, but state machines are deterministic. And if you can marry the two, you will have a much better time of building these complex systems. And so it ties back to, I think like there's some really interesting themes here. It's a similar thing of like first principles. How do you make it easy? How do you make it understandable? How do you make something observable? How do you make it sort of more deterministic to develop with? And what does that then fundamentally mean? And it means that you need observability. You need to track the inputs and outputs because you're probably going to be using some eval product, whether it's like an OSS thing or not. And you're probably going to be running all of these complex things using an orchestration platform that will generate that observability for you. And then you also need to manage the inputs and outputs and make things successful instead of non-deterministic. So the first principle is there about like, again, what problem are we solving and what does this mean for the future become particularly important, because then you can orient yourself. And we were basically like, well, people are using us for AI. We generate the observability data, so we should make that easier for you. And then we should also make this state stuff easier to track. And that is basically where people end up going. And then making sure that you're making the right decisions is important, because like all of that is still an assumption, you know. And I think we've got more to do actually with Agent Kit, AI observability, which is coming soon, which is super exciting.
Yeah, it's super exciting. I think the other thing that's been top of mind for us is we're seeing more and more that you mentioned Lovable, like LLMs are writing code. In some ways, they're becoming like kingmakers of developer tools, because if Claude Code or Lovable or V0 or whatever it might be suggests using your developer tool, you suddenly get this massive wave of adoption from this new type of user. And I think what we've seen is people start thinking about not just developer experience, but agent experience, and how do you sort of index highly and become a favorite tool of the LLM. Because like, do you think of that, has that affected the way you think about your roadmap and you think about designing the tool, or do you think of agent experience as largely overlapping with developer experience? Yeah,
totally. Definitely the latter. Agent experience definitely overlaps with the developer experience. And on the face of it, just one thing, we've been lucky with that. And it's like manufactured luck in a way, but definitely lucky. So for example, when we talked originally about the step.run APIs abstracting queues and events and such, that's super cool, because as a developer, you write 4 lines of code and an insane amount of stuff is done for you. And as an agent, you write those same 4 lines of code and you don't have to worry about queues or the same stuff.
Yep.
And so that means that instead of an agent having to spin its loop, creating a worker that subscribes to a topic that then runs in its own container and then does the entire infrastructure for you and then does the publishing, which is not going to work. Like, it's just going to spin. You just like have an agent run the step.run and the entire thing is done for you. So like abstracting things to a high enough level, not too high, but a high enough level that the developer becomes super efficient, does the same thing for agents, because fundamentally they're one and the same.
Yeah.
That's weird, but they kind of, the outcome is the same, right? Like then, you know what I mean?
Yeah. It's interesting that I think there was, some people assume the agent would be like a seasoned engineer who wants to write everything themselves. And it turns out LLMs are effectively acting like relatively lazy JavaScript engineers who are going to turn to the most convenient tool rather than the most complex one.
Yeah, exactly. They're going to short circuit. They're going to write some tests. If the tests fail, they might delete the test. They just like do the minimum, like do the absolute minimum. And so,
And it's inherent to the way that these systems are engineered, because if you know there's going to be a failure rate, then like reducing that failure rate by reducing the steps makes a whole lot of sense.
Exactly. So shorten the loop, compress the time, which is the overall aim of Ingest anyway. Make it super easy for you to build these sorts of products. And then you're kind of good to go. And that way you get the whole lovable V0 for front ends. When it comes time to building something that's like scalable, reliable, just out of the box, if you can build an API, whether it's in Next, whether it's just like a regular Django API if you're using Python, and have some steps in your API endpoint, and it suddenly does everything for you and automates all of that infrastructure stuff. You go from having to manually code your front end, having to manually code your back end, having to manually do all the orchestration and the queuing and the reliability and the scalability, and then plumbing in the observability manually. From like that to just honestly vibe coding the entire thing, and it works almost every time. And if you have an insane amount of scale, it just does the thing and you don't need to change it, which is cool. Yeah, it's like entirely out of the box.
Yeah, super interesting. I'm curious, like, do you have a point of view on, as LLMs write more and more code, which developer tools become obsolete and which become more important?
Yeah, that is a interesting question. I find the weird rise of SQLite timely, and a lot of people have said this. The sort of like personal software, like you would have personal computing back in the day in the 90s, where everyone had their own computer. And as an idea, that's interesting. Will it play out with all these vibe coders that build their own apps that are non-technical? Maybe. And if so, databases, arbitrary code hosting, APIs, all this sort of stuff sort of wins. That's super interesting. And that means that all of those tools become more important. To a degree, does it mean that things centralize? Like, yeah, also maybe, I think a few people have talked about this. I can't remember who, but it's like fairly obvious. If you have a model that was written in October of 2023, its knowledge cutoff is October 2023. Therefore, any tools released after October 2023 aren't in the index and they won't get recommended. So in a way, it sort of enshrines everything that was built before the model cutoff dates. And so like it gets, to a degree, it gets harder to build new stuff because the more prolific you are, the more content is out there, the more it's in the index. And so like it's there's a lot to it. The idea of personal computing is basically personal software is the one thing that I keep coming back to that sort of like makes the winners even bigger versus the other folks sort of losing. I think there'll end up being a wider gap between the winners that are winning.
Yeah, the winners that are, more and more software gets written.
Yeah.
The LLMs can make the tools, and so you have just runaway winners. In the future, if we turn the clock forward 5 years, what do you think Inngest's role is in that world?
Wedge being orchestration, step functions and stuff, that's an interesting level of abstraction. If we make that work with the entire backend using steps everywhere, we get all of the information that happens in your system, the events that run things, people's orders and all that stuff. And we can give you all of that, give you all the APIs around that, give you all the insights and give you basically everything to run your entire backend, which is super exciting. And it does it in a way in which you don't need Terraform. You don't need to worry about scale. You just deploy the thing and somehow it magically works. So essentially moving into scalable, reliable backends overall is the thing. And then you get the vibe coded front end. If you want, you can vibe code your back end because it should work because it'll be a few lines of code. Everything else will be taken care of for you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of the combination of LLMs allowing anybody to write code and tools like Inngest allowing that code to be scalable and reliable. Just creates this boon of software.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Super interesting. I want to take a little bit of a step back. I know you guys have kept the team intentionally quite small. I'm curious, like, how do you think about your hiring philosophy and when to add versus when to sort of keep the team lean and focused?
Yeah. So opinionated about this one. A few things. We hire really, really, really talented people versus people that are less experienced. So we take experience over quantity. That helps us make better, more informed decisions, better taste. And then secondly, the company is, like those radar diagrams where you get like the graph and the sort of numbers around. Like I sort of view companies a little bit like that, in which you can't really just grow GTM without like product and such. And you can't really grow product without design because front end will be back behind. So there's this like balance that you need to achieve. And essentially every couple of weeks, I do this every week, just look at the company. What happened? What was successful? What was bad? Where are the teams struggling? Is there a common pattern that's emerged over the last month? which areas now need refining. And if, for example, we hire another designer and now there are 2 designers versus a couple front-end people, you're going to then have to readjust product in the future. So understanding that changes that were made a month, 2 months, 6 months ago, what that means for the company in the future, reevaluating almost all the time to make sure that you have balance is important. So we have a direction, do the raise, and you're like, we need to get X, Y, and Z, and we need to grow, and this is likely what we need to do. We have a headcount plan, but like that's also an assumption early on, and then readjusting essentially every month to make sure that we're making good decisions is important. And like a lot of it's obvious.
Yeah.
Like a lot of it's super obvious when you're early on. You know, we need to hire marketing. We need to hire somebody on engineering because this stuff is failing. But I think like it's still good to be informed and also anticipate the future, because like hiring good people can take time.
Yeah.
Like a lot of time.
It's a mix of being reactive and being proactive.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. And like thinking about, for example, we hired a brand designer, Sophia. She's fantastic. And that's because we're going to hire more in GTM, and design is going to be absolutely underwater. And so we need to make both of those hires at once, so that in 2 months' time, we are not struggling.
Yeah.
So that's important as well.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. You mentioned this at some point, like phase 1 for you guys was really refining the product, and before you kind of got go-to-market going, and then you kind of really had to hammer go-to-market for a while until there was real inflection in the business, which is all to say, like almost every startup, not everything was sort of taking off from day zero.
Yeah.
I'm curious, like within that and within sort of the slow burn part of the company, how do you maintain your sort of motivation and resilience, and what other advice would you give to founders who are in sort of that part of their journey?
Delusion.
That helps.
Yeah. No, but like on a serious note, I think we might have been a bit atypical actually. Like I had a plan for the company a year before I started it, and then thought about the format and the events and all the things that we could do. But like we validated it pretty heavily. And it's like a pretty obvious problem that queuing in serverless was terrible, orchestration systems terrible, events really hard to deal with, and it does take months. And if you speak to any engineer that's done this sort of stuff, it's like 100% a problem. So for us, I think we knew that there was a problem to solve. We'd seen early interest, and like, sure, things stutter. And that's then a reflection of like, what do we need to change in order to get better? And there are so many things that impact that. Like, is it the messaging? Is it literally a bug in the app? Is it local friction, local testing? Is it time to value? There are so many variables when you start a company that like, you can't immediately assume, oh, we're doing the wrong thing. And sometimes it can be really disheartening, like genuinely disheartening, to work on something and then it doesn't pan out. And so like, I was actually having this conversation with the browser use folks. They faced the same thing way back when at the beginning of YC. And it turns out that like an interesting trick that we talked about is to just say like, hey, I'm going to prove to myself that this doesn't work, instead of I really want this to work. And then you find yourself like actually really motivated to prove to yourself that you are actually, I had this idea, I want to make sure that it doesn't work, instead of, and then flipping that in a way helps you, if you're in a bit of a rut, gain some confidence, because if it does work out, you're winning. Yeah. And if it doesn't work out, you've bet on yourself. And so when you do get in a little bit of a rut, which is inevitable when you're like pre-seed or seed, like there's so many little things that you need to do, and it's like discipline, motivation, but honestly, validating that you're doing the right thing. You know, I think there's definitely a balance between you just never give up. That's like the OG Paul Graham advice, right? Like never give up. But at the same time, like what if you truly are working on the wrong thing? And there's definitely a balance, but like you really, really, really need to get as much information as possible, you know? Like ultimately, you know, the whole like zero-sum game, if there was perfect information in the economy and whatnot, like just if you have as much information about what you're doing as possible, you can then make like an informed decision. Yeah. But yeah, there are definitely tricks you have to play. It's not the easiest thing in the world.
Yeah, informed delusion.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Okay, maybe that's a good place to end. But this has been super interesting conversation, and clearly you guys have accomplished a lot, taking Inngest to Series A, and we're super excited about the road ahead. So congrats on the fundraise, and looking forward to seeing how things scale from here. Thanks, man.
It's been incredible to work with you. We're really lucky to get to work with you. So yeah, consider this like honestly, wouldn't be here without you. So thank you so much.
Appreciate you saying that, and we're we're super excited to be investors in the company.
Thanks, man.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of Founder Real Talk. We really hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you heard, please rate and review us on your podcast app to help others find this podcast. If you have any questions you'd like to ask our guests or founders you'd like to hear on this podcast, feel free to email us at frt@notablecap.com. Notable Capital is a global venture capital firm based in the US, focused on early to growth stage companies in business and consumer applications and cloud infrastructure, which includes AI, cybersecurity, data, DevOps, and more. The firm has offices in Silicon Valley, San Francisco, and New York. We invest primarily in the US, Israel, Europe, and Latin America. Notable Capital's enterprise portfolio includes companies such as BitSight, Block, Dscope, Drata, HashiCorp, Monte Carlo, Neon, Nozomi Networks, Orca Security, Slack, Synac, Vercel, Zendesk, and many more. Learn more at notablecap.com or follow us on X and LinkedIn at Notable Capital.
This episode was produced by Sashi Productions, music produced by Gus Culpo. The opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individuals only and do not reflect the views of their respective employers or affiliates. The information provided is for informational purposes only and should not be considered or deemed to be as investment advice in any way. Thanks again for tuning in.